as allegations and long-standing rumors continue to shadow one of the most iconic legacies in modern music. I found myself sitting across from a man the world thought it already knew. This time, it was not the voice of Michael Jackson that filled the silence, but that of his father, Joe Jackson, finally choosing to speak for himself. No longer the distant, iron-fisted figure frozen in public memory, Joe leaned forward, deliberately pulling back years of quiet restraint to offer his own account of events, an account he insists has never truly been heard or understood. As he spoke of relentless discipline, punishing rehearsals, and the blinding glow of fame that masked a fractured childhood, one question lingered between us. Were these sacrifices an unavoidable toll of greatness, or a narrative reshaped and magnified by accusation, hindsight, and a world eager to believe the worst? There are stories the world assumes it has already judged, filed away under familiar headlines and repeated narratives. Yet when I sat down with Joe Jackson, I realized how fragile those assumptions truly are. History has flattened him into a symbol, often harsh, often condemned, caught forever between accusations of severity and claims of devotion. What unfolded in our conversation, however, was not the voice of a villain or a saint, but of a man shaped by circumstance, fear, and an unforgiving environment long before fame ever entered his household. Joe Jackson never sang to sold-out arenas. He never stood beneath spotlights or heard crowds chant his name. Instead, he stood inside factories. He reminded me that before the world knew Michael Jackson, it knew Gary. Indiana, a city that offered little mercy in the 1960s, Gary was not a place of dreams. It was steel and smoke, train horns cutting through the night, streets where temptation lingered once daylight faded. It was a working-class town where survival demanded toughness, and mistakes were rarely forgiven. Joe worked there. By day, he welded steel frames, a job where a single flawed seam could shut down an entire line. Precision was not optional, it was survival. When the factory whistle blew, his day rarely ended. Nights brought warehouse shifts, loading work, odd repairs, whatever paid cash. Not ambition, he insisted, but necessity drove him. 11 children waited at home, a household that large did not survive on hope alone. Music, he told me, was never meant to be stardom. At first, it was a strategy. Joe described coming home exhausted, only to see neighborhood corners crowded with laughter that masked risk. He had watched other families lose their children to the streets. Petty crime, bad company, futures cut short before they formed. He refused to let that be his family's story. So instead of letting his children roam, he brought the world indoors, not with toys or luxuries, but with second-hand instruments bought from pawn shops, battered guitars, rusted drum stands, microphones worn thin by previous dreams. He laid them out in the living room and set a rule that would define their lives. Stay home, practice, do something better. What began as distraction soon hardened into discipline. Joe spoke of structure the way athletes speak of training camps. Repetition, timing, accountability. Practice was daily, non-negotiable. He believed talent without rigor was wasted, and he pushed his children accordingly. From those cramped evenings after school emerged a family band that slowly transformed into the Jackson 5, drawing attention well beyond Gary's borders. When conversation turned to Michael, Joe paused longer than before. He remembered a boy still slight in frame, eyes lighting up whenever music filled the room. Others noticed later, he said, but he noticed early. Michael did not possess the strongest voice. That distinction belonged to Jermaine. What Michael had was presence, an ability to command attention before he fully understood what attention meant. Joe saw it in the way the child moved, sang, and silenced rooms that had no reason to listen. That recognition sharpened Joe's focus. Corrections became constant. Mistakes were repeated until erased. Rehearsals stretched late. Critics would later call it fear. Joe called it protection. He believed perfection was the only shield strong enough to pull his children out of Gary alive. Yet he acknowledged the cost. Somewhere between correction and command, distance formed. Michael stopped calling him Dad. He called him Joe. A subtle shift, but one that echoed loudly years later. As fame arrived and the world looked backward, questions multiplied. Was Joe Jackson too harsh? Stories spread of children freezing when he entered a room, of silence replacing laughter. Joe rejected the caricature. He insisted his methods were born of love, not cruelty. Love, as he practiced it, was not gentle. It was sacrifice, 2 jobs a day, years without rest, every dollar redirected into instruments, costumes, travel, and opportunity. Gary, Indiana still stands. It remains a witness to choices families once faced: harden or disappear. Joe chose hardness, believing it was the only armor available. When the Jackson 5 finally left that city behind, when club stages led to the Apollo Theater, he felt one certainty above all else. His children had escaped the downward pull he saw claim so many others. Time, however, has a way of rearranging memory. As Michael's stardom grew, the father behind the scenes faded into shadow, then into accusation. Allegations would later engulf the family name, casting Joe once more into public scrutiny. Sitting across from him now, decades removed from factory floors and rehearsal rooms, I did not hear denial of pain. I heard resistance to simplification. Joe Jackson does not ask to be admired. He does not ask to be forgiven. He asks to be understood in context, a man neither hero nor monster, but a father forged by a city that demanded severity and a world that later demanded answers. And it is in that uneasy space, between applause and accusation, discipline and devotion, that the enduring debate surrounding Michael Jackson's legacy and his father's role within it continues to live. When the front door closed each night in the Jackson household, Joe Jackson told me it did more than block out the noise of Gary. Indiana, the traffic, the street corners, the figures lingering after dark. It sealed the family inside a world governed by rhythm, repetition, and pressure. These were never casual music lessons. As Joe described it, rehearsal was effectively his third shift of the day. After hours in the factory and additional manual labor, he returned home not to rest, but to work again, this time armed not with welding tools or steel hammers, but with a metronome, an unblinking stare, and a foot that tapped time relentlessly against the floor. Joe repeatedly framed those nights as athletic training rather than childhood pastime. There was no allowance for distraction, no patience for carelessness. A wrong note meant starting over. A misstep erased progress. He enforced a schedule that showed little regard for the clock. Meals went cold. Evenings stretched late, and the sound of singing often outlasted the night. From his perspective, music was never entertainment. It was strategy. It was the only route he could see that led away from Gary's gravity, away from the cycle that pulled so many young black children into streets that offered shortcuts, but no future. He had no wealth to pass down, no formal education to rely on. Discipline was the only currency he possessed. That discipline, unsurprisingly, became the first fault line in the public narrative that followed. Over time, fragments of memory surfaced, some aligned, others contradictory. Stories circulated of rehearsals that ran past midnight, of raised voices following a missed beat. The image took hold of a father who demanded too much, too early, in an environment thick with tension. As Michael Jackson ascended from prodigy to global phenomenon, those recollections were revisited again and again, retrofitted to explain not only success, but alleged damage. Joe did not avoid these questions when I raised them. His response was blunt and consistent. What guided him was love, not cruelty. He acknowledged his severity without hesitation, insisting that firmness was the barrier that kept his children from slipping outside the door he worked so hard to close. He rejected the idea that harm was intentional. Any pain, he argued, belonged to an era that offered black families few safe paths upward, where resilience was demanded long before childhood had time to unfold. Within that structure, Michael emerged as the axis around which everything turned. Joe spoke openly about this, even critically. Jermaine, he said, had the stronger voice. Michael had something else entirely, a presence that seized attention instinctively. From the moment the boy stepped forward, rooms went quiet. Joe recognized that magnetism early, and with recognition came pressure. Michael rehearsed longer, repeated more, and carried expectations that grew heavier as the spotlight tightened around him. That spotlight, Joe admitted, reshaped their relationship in ways neither of them fully understood at the time. Michael did not call him Dad. He called him Joe. The distinction mattered. It marked a bond built on obligation rather than comfort, respect without intimacy. Joe sensed it even then. Michael complied, succeeded. delivered, but kept an emotional distance that later echoed in interviews where he spoke of fear rather than warmth. What surprised me most was Joe's admission that he, too, was unsettled by his son's brilliance. He described moments of anxiety, even physical discomfort, standing beside a child whose talent eclipsed control. It was not resentment, he insisted, but unease, the disorientation of a man who had engineered success only to feel diminished by its scale. The contradiction was stark. He forged the path, yet felt overshadowed by the light it produced. From the outside, the public struggled to settle on a single interpretation. Sympathy pulled in one direction, admiration in another. Media accounts multiplied, each emphasizing a different truth, each sharpening or softening Joe's image according to its own lens. He remained unmoved. Criticism did not bend him. Without that discipline, he said, there would be no story to analyze at all. Still, the marks remained. Not dramatic injuries, not scenes of overt violence, but quieter impressions that lingered. The children remembered rhythm more than lullabies, structure more than ease. Michael carried those memories with him into superstardom, his gaze drifting whenever the name Joe surfaced. Joe Jackson's story exists in tension. On one side, a living room transformed into a refuge, where music stood guard against the streets. On the other, the enduring image of a father unable or unwilling to soften his demands. The truth rests somewhere between devotion and damage. Between it was love and the silence of children who learned to perform before they learned to rest. Joe was neither villain nor savior. He was a product of his time, convinced that rigor could substitute for tenderness. And in doing so, he built a legend while leaving wounds that time never fully closed. Stage lights, Joe Jackson reminded me during our conversation, are designed to dazzle. What they rarely reveal are the shadows they create behind them. As Michael began to emerge from the collective presence of his brothers and move unmistakably into the center of attention, the Jackson family entered a chapter that was as triumphant as it was fractured. From the unforgiving rehearsals in a cramped garage in Gary, Indiana, to the thunderous applause of the Apollo Theater, each step forward seemed to widen the emotional distance between Michael and the man who had built the path beneath his feet. His father. Joe spoke candidly about recognizing Michael's abilities early on. While the other boys had to work relentlessly to stay in tune and on rhythm, Michael appeared almost instinctive, as though performance was native to him. His voice carried a tone that lingered, and his movements, fluid, effortless, commanding, captured attention before audiences realized they were watching something different. Joe recalled it plainly. Michael moved as if the music lived inside him. He was equally direct in his comparisons. Jermaine, he said, possessed the stronger vocal power. Michael, however, had presence, an intangible quality that could not be taught or replicated. Joe acknowledged that this imbalance shaped everything that followed. When the spotlight fixes itself on one child, it does not simply illuminate talent, it rearranges family dynamics, often leaving others standing just beyond its reach. When the Jackson Five began gaining real momentum, the invitation to perform at Harlem's Apollo Theater marked a turning point. The crowd's response was electric. Opportunities multiplied quickly, and contracts followed applause. Yet the speed of success left little room for adjustment. Schedules filled, performances stacked one after another, and personal space disappeared. For Michael, still barely out of childhood, the pressure came not only from the stage, but from the constant scrutiny of his father's expectations. Joe never softened his approach. He maintained the same rigid standards that had defined their early years. Perfection was not optional. No missed beats, no careless steps, no margin for error. He described the group as a competitive team, insisting that discipline was the only way to win. And Michael, as the focal point, carried the heaviest burden of all. As public attention narrowed onto Michael, fault lines within the family became harder to ignore. The other brothers, Joe admitted, were sometimes eclipsed. Michael was increasingly framed as the essence of the group, its defining force. That framing only intensified Joe's demands, driven by the fear that one mistake from his brightest star could unravel everything they had built. With fame came scrutiny. Reporters no longer confined themselves to music. They searched for private details, for explanations behind success. Stories about Joe Jackson began circulating, some sympathetic, others accusatory. Former acquaintances, neighbors from Gary, and people on the edges of the family offered conflicting recollections. To some, Joe was severe but motivated by love. To others, he was a man who allowed his temper to surface too easily. The narrative shifted decisively when Michael, years later and already a global icon, said he had been frightened of his father. It was not framed as an accusation, but it did not need to be. That single word traveled faster than context ever could, attaching itself permanently to Joe's name. Joe did not dispute his strictness when I asked him. He embraced it. He spoke of Gary as a place where children were surrounded by gangs, drugs, and crime, and where safety required constant vigilance. He worked multiple jobs, he said, not for ambition but survival. Discipline, in his view, was protection. What wounded him most was how the media recast that protection as cruelty. Even details like Michael calling him Joe instead of Dad were interpreted as proof of emotional distance. Joe dismissed that reading, explaining it as a family habit rather than rejection. But nuance rarely survives headlines, and his explanations were drowned out by more sensational versions of the story. What often went unexamined, Joe noted, was how fame itself strained the family. When one child becomes extraordinary, every expectation intensifies. Michael, despite his genius, was still a boy forced to mature too quickly. Joe, whose intentions he insists were rooted in love, became emblematic of control rather than care. As Michael pursued independence and creative freedom, the tension deepened. He sought to escape the label of being Joe Jackson's son, while Joe struggled to understand a vision of success that no longer aligned with his own. Their differences, generational, emotional, philosophical, hardened over time. When Michael's solo career soared, the Jackson 5 faded into history. Joe, once the architect behind every rehearsal and decision, was left with memories colored by pride and regret. He questioned whether the same strictness that propelled his son to greatness also pushed him away. "I gave everything," he told me, "and somehow I became the villain." That contradiction defines this chapter. The rise of Michael Jackson, one of the most influential artists of the modern era, is inseparable from a family story marked by strain and sacrifice. Joe Jackson was both the foundation of that ascent and the figure who carried its heaviest accusations. The spotlight elevated Michael to global immortality, but it also exposed every fracture between father and son, leaving a legacy balanced uneasily between gratitude and resentment. In the years following Michael Jackson's rise to global superstardom, the past of the Jackson family was never allowed to rest. Yet there was a moment when public scrutiny sharpened into something far more volatile, when attention shifted decisively toward the man long positioned behind the legend. Joe Jackson, what had once circulated as rumor, backstage chatter, or loosely quoted remarks began to harden into formal accusations, carried by newspapers, books, and television broadcasts that treated speculation as narrative. That turning point did not originate with an exposé or investigative scoop. It began, quietly but powerfully, with words spoken by Michael Jackson himself. In several interviews, Michael acknowledged that he had once been frightened of his father. On its own, the comment might have passed as a personal reflection. Spoken by one of the most famous figures on the planet, it became an accelerant, reigniting every unresolved suspicion surrounding Joe Jackson. The media moved swiftly. Headlines multiplied, each more provocative than the last, framing Joe as a figure of menace rather than complexity. Questions replaced nuance, and curiosity slid easily into judgment. The image of a demanding father evolved into that of a controversial authority figure, shaped less by context than by repetition. As the narrative gained momentum, people from the Jacksons' past were summoned to speak. Former acquaintances, neighbors from Gary, Indiana, and industry insiders offered recollections that rarely aligned. Some described Joe as uncompromising and quick-tempered. Others insisted he was firm but purposeful, driven by the need to shield his children from a city defined at the time by gangs, violence, and drugs. The contradictions only fueled the debate. Under mounting pressure, Joe Jackson chose not to disappear. He appeared publicly, granting interviews and confronting the accusations directly. When asked about his reputation for severity, he offered a defense that would be quoted for years. He had not been cruel, he said. He had been protective. For Joe, discipline was a barrier between his children and the streets. He repeatedly returned to context. raising a large black family in Gary during the 1960s and 1970s, he explained, required toughness. Economic insecurity, racial discrimination, and urban decay left little margin for error. You had to be hard to raise kids back then, he said, framing his choices as necessity rather than excess. Those statements divided public opinion almost cleanly in two. One side viewed them as rationalizations from a father who had crossed an invisible line. To these critics, Michael's admission of fear symbolized a childhood burdened by pressure, where success was inseparable from loss. The other side heard something different, the voice of a working-class parent shaped by hardship, defending methods once widely accepted, if rarely questioned. Understanding that divide requires revisiting Gary itself. At the time, the city was in industrial decline, marked by unemployment and persistent social problems. Joe worked as a welder by day and took additional jobs at night, focused less on ambition than survival. For him, strictness was not ideology, it was a tool. In that era, particularly within working-class families, discipline was often seen as essential. Parents believed firmness built resilience and kept children from making irreversible mistakes. Joe never denied being strict. He consistently denied intent to harm, insisting his actions were rooted in care. As the debate intensified, the public fractured further. Many fans interpreted Michael's words as confirmation that greatness had been forged through fear. Others countered that Joe's sacrifices, working multiple jobs, enduring physical strain, demonstrated commitment rather than domination. Gradually, a central question emerged. Did Michael Jackson's extraordinary success come at the cost of an unbearably difficult childhood? The media leaned heavily into contrast. Michael appeared as the embodiment of freedom and creativity, while Joe was cast as rigid control personified. Headlines reduced complexity to symbolism, locking Joe into a role he could not easily escape. Joe did not retreat from that portrayal. He maintained that, given the same circumstances, he would make the same choices again. Without discipline, he argued, there would have been no escape from poverty, no global recognition, no legacy. That stance became the most contentious point of all. Could discipline be both the foundation of success and the source of lasting emotional wounds? As the uproar softened with time, scholars and psychologists reframed the story as part of a broader social debate. Where does discipline end and cruelty begin? And must success require sacrifice at such a young age? Joe Jackson came to symbolize that question, not only as a famous father, but as a representative of a generation that believed firmness was salvation. To some, he remained a man who gave everything for his children's future. To others, he was defined by the fear his son publicly acknowledged. The truth likely resides between those extremes. Joe Jackson was neither the monster of tabloid caricature nor the gentle patriarch of idealized memory. He was a father shaped by his era, unyielding, driven, loving in a way that often appeared harsh. When the accusations finally receded, they left an indelible mark on the Jackson legacy. The achievements endured, but so did the question Joe carried to his grave. Was he the builder of a legend, or the embodiment of a rigid discipline the world no longer knows how to judge? Time, Joe Jackson reflected as we spoke, has a way of dimming the spotlight, but never quite erasing what it leaves behind. In the final stretch of his life, when declining health slowed his movements and the constant travel that once defined him came to an end, Joe found himself turning inward. The man who had stood behind one of the most consequential musical families of the 20th century spent those years revisiting the past, its triumphs, its damage, and his own reflection within it. I met him in a quiet room crowded with family photographs. There were early black and white images of the Jackson 5 in homemade stage outfits, and glossy frames capturing Michael Jackson beneath stage lights, his glove catching the glare. Joe studied those pictures with unmistakable pride. He told me, firmly, that he had never walked away from his children. He worked for them. He guided them. In his mind, that was his final accounting. Not flawless fatherhood, but presence and responsibility. He spoke of double shifts and sleepless nights, of stretching limited savings to buy the first instruments that would change the family's direction. His pride, he emphasized, was not anchored in sales figures or sold-out arenas, but in the transformation of the Jackson name into a symbol recognized around the world. Yet the mirror Joe described was never purely flattering. Alongside achievement were fractures that never fully closed. Michael's admission, years earlier, that he had been frightened of his father followed Joe relentlessly. He did not deny the intensity of the rehearsals or the pressure his children endured. He insisted, again and again, that the intention had never been harm. Love, as he practiced it, was stern and unyielding. Joe reminded me of moments that rarely found their way into headlines. Times he intervened when his children were sick, or when outsiders attempted to exploit their talent. Those stories, he said, were overshadowed by a media narrative that preferred simpler labels. The iron-fisted father, the man of steel, the specter looming over a child's past. That imbalance weighed on him. He felt reduced to a character split in two, the life he knew he had lived, and the version constructed by public imagination. In later conversations, Joe returned often to the idea that his affection was never demonstrative. It showed itself in early mornings, late returns, and an unrelenting effort to keep his children away from the dangers of Gary, Indiana. He told me once, his voice noticeably softer, that he had never raised his children to fail. He raised them to endure, to compete, to survive. It was not gentle love, he conceded, but it was the only form he knew, shaped by his own life as a welder and a father responsible for many mouths. What Joe admitted most freely was regret, not over criticism, but over unfinished conversations. Michael's death in 2009 closed doors that could never be reopened, leaving questions unresolved and emotions unspoken. Joe acknowledged the distance between them, but rejected the idea that it equated to resentment. Whatever the world believed, Michael was his son. As the end approached, Joe spoke less about contracts and money and more about memory. He recalled the laughter at early school performances, the excitement of buying a first drum kit, the moment the Jackson 5 signed their initial major deal. These memories, he felt, justified the life he had led. The legacy he left behind extends far beyond a single band. The Jackson 5 altered the course of popular music and paved the way for future generations, including Michael and Janet. But attached to that achievement is a question that refuses to fade: whether such success required a childhood shaped more by pressure than ease. Even after Joe's death in 2018, opinion remains divided. Some see him as the architect of an empire, others as a symbol of an era when discipline was unforgiving and children matured too soon. The story resists closure. Each interview, each documentary, resurrects his name with new interpretations, admiration, blame, sympathy, curiosity. Joe left behind what might best be described as a cracked mirror. Those who look into it see different reflections. Some see determination and rescue from poverty. Others see the cost of relentless expectation. When asked if he had regrets, his answer never changed. He did what he believed was necessary to secure a future for his children. That answer settles nothing, but it reveals something essential. Joe Jackson lived as if life were a battle, fighting for his family, shielding them from deprivation, yet leaving behind wounds no success could fully repair. When the applause faded and the lights went dark, what remained was an aging father confronting his reflection, still wondering whether his children would ever recognize the love he gave, even though it arrived without softness. The story Joe Jackson shared with me is not merely one of music, celebrity, or life under unforgiving stage lights. It is, at its core, the portrait of a father shaped by contradiction, by sacrifice, resolve, and misunderstandings that time never fully untangled. Listening to him speak, it became clear that the legacy he built is admired across the world, yet shadowed by questions that refuse simple answers. He forged a path out of poverty for his family, but in doing so, left behind a debate that still resonates. Can uncompromising love shield children from harm? Or does it quietly create emotional distance that only surfaces years later? What remains undeniable, beyond applause and accusation alike, is Joe Jackson's constancy. He did not claim perfection, nor did he seek absolution. He spoke instead of persistence, of being present in the only way he knew how, determined to pull his children out of hardship and into possibility. That determination produced a legacy inseparable from the voice and influence of Michael Jackson, a legacy marked by brilliance, strain, and enduring complexity. Whatever cracks history chooses to emphasize, the light of that achievement continues to echo, much like the music itself. If this story resonates with you, consider sharing your thoughts, engaging in the conversation, and following along as we continue to examine the emotional realities behind the lives of the world's most influential music legends.